Well, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. Welcome to IO Ideas. This is our ninth year of doing this event. It's a 2-day event, and yeah, we're just excited for everybody who's logging on to listen. I want to start by just thanking our primary presenting sponsor, who's ITC Midwest. And then just introduce myself. I'm Vanessa Miller. I'm a reporter, higher education reporter with the Gazette. I've been doing that for since 2013, so 12 years. And this session that you're tuning into is on academic freedoms, which is obviously something that we've been hearing a lot about in the news lately, and seeing maybe in our daily lives in Iowa and the region. So I just want to start by asking each of our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves and talk just a little bit about their knowledge on this issue. So yeah, whoever wants to start.
Sure. I'll go first. Thanks, Vanessa. Really appreciate having me on this panel. I'm Zach Greenberg. I am the Faculty Legal Defense Counsel at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that defends free speech nationwide, with a particular focus on college campuses. In my role, we defend faculty members' academic freedom to teach, to research, to express themselves on controversial issues. We've been doing this since 1999 when we were founded. And it's been quite the moment for academic freedom here in America after the recent news about Charlie Kirk and the fallout from that, seeing a lot of faculty members being punished for their speech on this topic. And our goal is to defend these faculty members, get them back in the classroom, get the universities to recognize their free speech rights, and get a larger society to understand the importance of academic freedom, not only as a value to the institutions, but also for our nation, allowing the professors who are at our universities to express themselves to the full extent of the First Amendment.
Great. Thanks, Zach. My name is Isaac Kamola. I direct the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom at the American Association of University Professors. The AAUP was founded in 1915 and is the professional association that represents faculty. We have 50,000 plus members and growing, and we represent faculty on hundreds of campuses, sometimes in advocacy chapters and sometimes in collective bargaining in unionized faculty. The American understanding of tenure and shared governance were created by the AAUP. And the AAUP has been a standing defender of academic freedom. The Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom is part of the AAUP, and our goal is to try to communicate the value of academic freedom to a broad audience. The AAUP has a very technical understanding of what academic freedom is that is hard to translate to a broad audience. So the center creates resources to help support faculty in their defense of academic freedom, and also try to communicate the value of academic freedom to a wide audience. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. And
I'm
Daryl?
Daryl West. I'm a senior fellow in the government. Yes, I'm Daryl West. I'm a senior fellow in the Government Studies program of the Brookings Institution. We are a Washington think tank, so we do research on governance issues, basically how our system performs, what the problems are, and ways to think about improving situations. And prior to my time at Brookings, I was a faculty member in political science at Brown University. So I taught there for a number of years, but have been in DC for the last 17 years.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you guys. I also wanted to just let everyone know who's listening in that if you have questions, go ahead and send those. You can put them in the Q&A box or in the chat function in the Zoom link, and the moderator will send those to me so that I can ask them of our panelists in real time, which I find makes the conversation move better. So yeah, if you think of anything you want to ask, throw those out, and we'll make sure that our panelists can talk about them a little bit. So I guess just to start, I wanted to ask you each if you could talk a little bit about what has actually changed. What are we looking at today in terms of the academic freedom landscape compared to 1 year ago, 5 years ago? How different does it look?
Thanks, Vanessa. I think that's a really important question, and I think it looks quite different. I think that issues of campus speech have always been real and have always been incredibly difficult. I think it's important to understand that universities both value free expression and try to maximize free expression, but they're also places where students live and work and eat, and that there's a lot of pressures on trying to figure out how to balance legally mandated inclusion, such as Title VI, Title IX, non-discrimination laws, with free expression. And some schools do that really well, and some schools do it not so well. And that's always an incredibly tough a balance to get right. And I would say it's impossible to figure out what that precise balance is. However, in the last 5 years, and I would really say the Black Lives Matter protests were a pivotal moment. You may remember the summer of 2020, that ideas about racial inequality literally came out of the classroom and into the streets. There was transformative moments, I know in my own life, where I was thinking about a racial inequality in much more robust and serious ways than I had before. I was having conversations with my family about structural racism, and was really rethinking how American society was imagined and constructed as a whole. And then if you remember this moment in late 2017, in late September, early October, when all of a sudden everybody started talking about critical race theory out of nowhere, everybody was like wringing their hands about this terrible thing called critical race theory that only legal scholars had heard of up to that point, right? And I pinpoint that as the beginning of a very intense backlash against higher education that was organized and well-funded. And it really led to a bunch of legislative actions, including what were anti-CRT bills, or sometimes known as the divisive concept bills, such as Florida's Stop Woke Act. And then that kind of also attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, in both cases really slandering what those programs actually are, what critical race theory actually is, slandering the diversity work that actually takes place on college campuses, misrepresenting it. And I see that as part of an intense backlash to the Black Lives Matter protests and the gains for social justice and racial equity that were made during that time. Those state laws in Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and elsewhere were really effective at basically tamping down on certain types of speech, but was limited to the states. And then when Trump came to power, he was able to use new levers that are only available to the federal government, such as grant funding, visas, extortion letters, as a way of basically amping up that backlash to an even greater proportion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing also that would be really helpful, maybe, and instructive as we get this conversation started, is just to like define some things. So, because I think when we're talking about academic freedom, it gets sometimes kind of meshed with like First Amendment rights and who we're talking about. Are we talking about students? Are we talking about staff? Are we talking about faculty? Are we talking about tenured people? Like what are is everybody have the same rights or not? And like, what are we talking about as being under threat sort of specifically right now?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There hasn't been a truly unifying definition of academic freedom from courts or from scholars for a while. FIRE has their own definition, and we're of course always open to criticism and feedback on that. And we see academic freedom as the general recognition that professors should be free to teach and research and debate ideas without institutional or outside interference. So whether that's punishment by their universities or by the state governments that govern these universities. That's our definition. It's rooted in the First Amendment because courts have said that academic freedom is a special concern of the First Amendment, and it doesn't tolerate rules that cast the pallid orthodoxy on the classroom. And there's been some good decisions really protecting the individual right of professors to teach and research and debate ideas. There's also institutional academic freedom, which is even less developed in case law than professor academic freedom. And this comes from the Sweezy case, the idea that the government should not tell universities who to teach what to teach, who they may hire, and what may be taught, which are generally considered the protection against rules that dictate curricular decisions and classroom discussion. That's a general definition of academic freedom. We can get down to it in the nitty gritty, but we like to believe it protects both professors on the individual level and institutions and how they run their academic affairs.
Yeah, got it. And when you talk about faculty and professors, are you differentiating, like, do instructors or people who, are not on a tenure track in any way?
Yeah,
do they have
absolutely.
less, or are they covered under your definition?
They're covered. It's anyone with an academic role. This would include library staff. This would include instructors, lecturers, adjunct professors. It's not limited to your tenured professors. It's really anyone that teaches classes, including graduate students as well, when they're in the classroom fulfilling their role. We want it to be expansive. It does not, unfortunately, include administrators and staff members with no academic or teaching role. But yeah, really, if you fulfill academic duties of teaching and research, you're protected by academic freedom.
Got it. Okay. And then how does that cross over with, like, just free speech and like the First Amendment stuff that folks are talking about on campuses right now?
I would say, and again, this is just our take on this, is that the First Amendment informs academic freedom, which is a broader, more grounded concept in professional norms and the standards set by advocacy organizations and faculty unions like the AUP, for example, which has a lot of great statements about academic freedom, what it protects, and why it's important. So in terms of the case law, I would say that's kind of the baseline. That's the minimum standard here. But we think academic freedom protects even more speech and expression and academic duties beyond what courts have said to this point, partially because courts haven't been super clear about what it really means. And so for a modern definition, we want to have a bit more expansive freedom to deal with things like the attacks we're seeing on Harvard and Columbia, the punishment of professors for commenting on Charlie Kirk, and the state legislative efforts to curtail in-class professorial speech.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, well, and we do have a question that I want to ask from somebody who's listening in here, and I think it's talking a little bit about whether we're not. I think it's getting to the point that it's trying to get to is whether we're not in a sort of unprecedented era, or whether we can use history if we've seen this before. So the question is, are historical analogies useful and worth thinking about, both in terms of what happened and solutions? Angela Davis and UCLA come to mind. It's hard to not see the quote, "They were a communist in the 50s, 60s, and 70s," and compare that to quote, "They support Palestinians in 2025." So I think that was an example. But yeah, I mean, what have we seen this before? Is this unprecedented? Where are we when we look back at history?
I mean, perhaps I can jump in on that. So I've been an educator for more than 40 years now, and things do seem different now. I mean, certainly there have been historical examples in other time periods where there have been government crackdowns, politicians who criticize professors, feeling that they're too liberal, they don't represent the country as a whole. So those types of attacks certainly have some historical precedents. But there are some aspects of the current situation that I think make even those types of attacks more dangerous. One of the things that clearly is different about this era is just the role of technology. So when I used to teach my political science students at Brown University, it was basically me and the students in the classroom. Today, students, because of cell phones, have the ability to record what professors are saying through social media accounts. They can immediately post this online through YouTube and other platforms. Those posts can reach thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, or even much larger numbers of people. And things can go viral, things can be taken out of context. And so people can get in bigger trouble now just because technology makes singling out individuals much easier and more attainable on their part. So I think the risks for faculty members have gone up enormously in recent years.
And I would say too, in addition to technology, which is a really big issue, and the example of Texas A&M, where the professor had her class videotaped, and there was an operative in the room who raised the question with the intention of having a political consequence. Is a perfect example of the weaponization of technology. But I also think that it's really important that what's going on at the state level, the use of the federal government and state governments to interfere in in higher education, I think is unprecedented. In fact, Ellen Schrecker, who wrote the book, the definitive book on McCarthyism in higher education, in 2023 wrote that this moment was worse than McCarthyism. And that was 2 years ago. And it hasn't gotten better, right? And her argument was, under McCarthyism, faculty were penalized for their political affiliations. Are you not a member of the Communist Party, right? But what's happening now is there's a deliberate, organized attempt to fundamentally transform what can and can't be taught in higher education. So, for example, the threats of laws in Texas that say you can't teach that there's more than two genders, right? Mm-hmm. That's a perfect example of the state saying, we don't like these ideas, even though they're backed by research, even though that's where the evidence has led the scholars to find these conclusions. We prefer these ideas, and therefore we're going to use the power of the state, not the power of argument, reason, debate, writing, evidence, in order to make those points. And so you're seeing just an incredible amount of effort at the state level and the federal level to fundamentally transform the institutions themselves. Another example in Iowa, the Center for Intellectual Freedom, these kinds of things are happening in states around the country where you actually have, instead of faculty determining the curriculum, which according to the notions of academic freedom is in the purview of the faculty, right? As a political scientist, I know what's best in my intro political science class. I know what should be on that syllabus better than DeSantis or Governor Abbott does, right? And so I should be the one who has the ability to make those kinds of decisions within the bounds and norms of the profession. However, what we're seeing is the creation of these academic centers that are designed to teach the other side, that are outside of faculty oversight. And that's really scary, because it's basically saying we are going to force the institutions to teach the ideas that we believe for political and ideological reasons, not allow faculty and students to follow knowledge wherever it leads them.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Iowa, obviously in the last legislative session, the legislature formed a specific higher education standing committee, not a temporary one. And their goal really was to reshape potentially higher education. And they brought in people from all different states who have informed other laws in Florida and in Texas, for example, to talk about many of the bills that were proposed at the state level. The Board of Regents did actually enact many of the policies proposed in those bills, even though they didn't pass, to just sort of get a jump on it. And obviously that committee isn't going anywhere, as they're going to bring that back and discuss that again more. One question that I just really want to ask and talk about a little bit is, because we are hearing, and I do want to hear what you guys think have been some of the biggest like executive orders, different things that have really come to roost, since the new administration has taken office. But I guess I'm wondering, like, why all this change? What is the main concern with higher education as it is and as it has been, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I know for recent attacks on academic freedom, I think it goes into the historical tension between conservative legislatures and politicians and then liberal universities. And it's goes back to the notion that these institutions predominantly, especially in the last couple of years, have been very activist, have been very political. Before institutional neutrality, they've been releasing statements on Israel-Palestine, for example, and allowing student activists to, in many cases, take over their institutions. And that can really draw the ire of the state governments who are funding these institutions, and the federal government, who, of course, funds pretty much all academic institutions through its programs. And so I can see the tension there, and I can understand why the politicians we have in today's day and age are seeing these as targets, as political footballs, trying to get them defunded or prosecuted for their beliefs and for their ideas, which poses a series of academic freedom and First Amendment issues, of course. But I also think it really demonstrates a misunderstanding of academic freedom and why it's important. At the institutional level, it's the notion that these institutions should be dedicated to the pursuit of truth and the discovery of knowledge. That's the academic goal here. And when that goal is fulfilled, they should be allowed to do so in their own capacities, even if their research and their expression does offend others, which inevitably it does. These institutions are home to scholars and activists and professors, and sometimes their findings will, of course, upset the status quo. However, I can see the counter argument that when these institutions become more activist and more political, when they do in fact dedicate themselves to, for example, attacking Trump and to antagonizing conservatives, you're going to have some pushback there. And I feel that as the institution drifts away from its academic purpose, it opens itself up more to these political attacks from the legislatures. However, the First Amendment still protects them regardless, right? You still can't retaliate against institutions or individuals based on what they say, what they believe. So as a legal matter, the prosecution of these institutions and the attempts to undermine their academic freedom would have the same fate, regardless of what the institution's purpose or their actions are.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, right. Like, do you think there's legitimacy in what lawmakers, conservative lawmakers primarily, are saying about there being an imbalance in terms of the ideology of professors? And if so, do you think that is seeping into classrooms, into what they teach, or do you think that they do a good job of keeping their personal beliefs out of what they're instructing?
Isaac, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I'm curious to hear what Daryl has to say as well. But in my experience, right, the vast majority of what goes on college campus is pretty much what you'd expect, right? Mm-hmm. That the teaching and the research goes on. And I think that it's important. There's that the notion that there's more liberals than conservatives, I think, is a canard, right? It's just basically saying that because I'm registered as a Democrat, I have certain ideas and I'm going to teach those in the classroom. I think if you actually go into most campus classrooms, you don't see that, right? Mm-hmm. I spend, my time, we read Adam Smith and we read Marx and we treat them as intellectual texts. We debate the differences and we allow students. I think that is pretty standard. That being said, there may be exceptions, but I think that there has been a political effort to take those exceptions and turn them into a myth of this kind of like rabidly lefty activist university. And that myth has then been used to cause political harm. It's what John Wilson has called myth making by anecdote, right? You take this example here and that example here and that example here, right? And I think that what's happened too is you have, for example, you can look at like probably the biggest example of this at the protests in Colombia over the genocide in Gaza, right? Mm-hmm. So you have students. One of my favorite signs from that protest was somebody said, "You asked me to read Edward Said. What do you think I would do?" Right? And I think that what we're seeing now is that there is an older generation of knowledge that basically says ideas reside in books, and we can sit here in the seminar room and have genteel conversations about big ideas. And then there's a growing body of knowledge that comes out of feminist scholarship, critical ethnic studies, that comes out of LGBTQ and queer theory, that is basically talking about embodied knowledge and experiential knowledge and knowledge that's embodied in institutions, right? It's a kind of intellectual argument that is not inconsistent with what's being taught in the classroom and what's cutting edge in many fields right now, to basically say that going out into the quad and protesting a policy is actually consistent with a set of intellectual arguments that are taking place, right? And so I think that it's really important that controversy and speech and protest has always been part of the university, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that we oftentimes look back at these moments, like the free speech movement in the 60s, or the anti-war movement, or the civil rights movement, and we say, oh my God, that was so amazing, the kinds of accomplishments that they achieved in that time, not realizing that at the moment they were villainized and demonized, seen as radicals, right? So in many ways, the world that we live in now, we owe a gratitude to people who in their day and age were on the cutting edge of thinking about the societies that we live in. And so I think that by saying that, oh, these students are too activist or whatnot, I think is kind of missing the point that this isn't just a triggered snowflake student who's lashing out, right? It's a set of arguments that are literally being enacted by, in my experience, incredibly thoughtful students who are really trying to figure out their way in the world, and sometimes do that in ways in which they make mistakes, and sometimes do that in ways that are really powerful and beautiful. And I think that what's really terrible about the current moment that Daryl talked about, with this weaponization of videos and this kind of political infrastructure that's targeting higher education, is you take out that ability for that kind of contestation in a way that so quickly turns into partisan politics in a way that's really destructive.
Yeah. I too, would love to hear your thoughts, Daryl, on whether, what this is actually looking like in the classroom. I do want to just note that we have a senator who represents Iowa State's district who just wants to chime in, and I don't know this reference, but he said it sounds like Scopes from California in 1925. If you guys get the reference, I'll throw that to you. But do you?
Yeah, that was the legal case involving the teaching of evolution. So there's a big lawsuit over that. So he's kind of suggesting that what we're seeing to now does have some historical parallels. But to build on some of the points that others have made, there's kind of a debate over what is the role of a university. And when I was teaching, I saw my job as trying to develop critical reasoning skills of my students. I didn't care really whether they become liberal, moderate, or conservative. I wanted them to think critically about whatever the subject matter was, and then to form their own opinions. I think there's some people in society now that believe universities should represent the whole political spectrum that is present in the country as a whole. So if the country is 30% conservative, that universities should reflect that. We don't really apply that standard to any other sector. We don't expect the business community to be 30% conservative. We don't expect our religious institutions to reflect whatever the prevailing political sentiments are. And so I think that is where some of the critics have gone wrong. They're trying to impose a model where universities should represent whatever the prevailing views are across the country. And I don't think that is what would benefit the future of the United States. We want our students thinking independently, to having critical reasoning skills, and then they will go off in whatever direction they choose.
Right. Well, and obviously one of the arguments that we're hearing from many of the conservative leaning lawmakers are that there has been sort of a stifling of conservative thought on campus and in classrooms, and so their intention, as they state, is to counter that and to enable more sort of free speech, free debate in the classroom. I guess my question for you is to whether some of the laws and policies that we're seeing are sort of doing the opposite. Do you see that professors are having some fear in the classroom about what they say?
Actually, the people who I know in the classroom are much more fearful than certainly a couple years ago, or even 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, when I was teaching, I didn't really worry that I was going to get in trouble for what I said in the classroom, because there was this norm of professional autonomy, that I was hired to be a professional. I was to bring my professional judgment into teaching. I did try and present balanced points of views. If I would hear a classroom conversation and it was getting too liberal, I would try and inject, how would a Republican, how would a conservative, libertarian this issue so that people were exposed to differing points of view. I think today, many of the colleagues who I know who are still in the classroom are fearful that they're being told what to do. If they say the wrong thing, it can get them fired, or that they may say something that is taken out of context and can be used to portray them in a particular way, which is either not what actually happened or certainly not what they intended. And so, with our current emphasis on tweets and social media posts and short videos, there are a lot of things that people might say that if you heard like the full 10, 20, or 30-minute conversation would not seem objectionable. But if you pull out one or two sentences, then you might be able to think, well, that person had said something highly objectionable.
And to that point, the data absolutely supports that argument. We are FIRE's Scholars Under Fire database and our faculty survey both indicate that professors are terrified of speaking out and will not comment or even discuss controversial issues in class because of the fear of being terminated or suspended for what they say. And this is before we even go to the Charlie Kirk stuff. This happened, a couple months ago. And it's way worse than it is in the McCarthy era. And I think when professors see their colleagues being fired, being suspended for discussing controversial issues or critical race theory or even just general political issues out there, it absolutely has a chilling effect on them. And if you're an adjunct, you're a professor without tenure, or maybe you're trying to support your family, it's a way better career move to keep your head down and not teach these classes than it is to go out there and comment on social media or publish controversial research or discuss these issues in class. And that's a real shame because that creates an environment of fear, of mistrust, where if the professors themselves aren't going to uphold free speech values, the students, they have no shot. It starts with the instructor in the class, establishing the academic freedom of the subject matter and of the classroom. And if they can't do it, it really casts out the purpose of the university and of the students who are graduating, who perhaps also believe that they keep their heads down, sit down and shut up, they can get ahead. And that's not good for our society or for any of the values of academic freedom and free speech that we hold dear.
Yeah,
that's really true. It does a huge disservice when faculty are scared to speak, because then what you get is a certain worldview that serves those who have political power or political interests, right? And not those who are trying to figure out the complex, messy world that we live in. And I think this whole issue too kind of comes down to this idea of the difference between academic freedom and free speech. That's really important. Because academic freedom, the academy is not about you can say whatever you want, right? In a way, the higher education is about vetting ideas, right? And saying that's not a good idea. That's not backed by the evidence. So if I'm teaching, let's say I'm teaching climate change and I'm teaching about the human causes of climate change, and a student says, sorry, I just don't believe that, right? I just don't believe that climate change is man-made.
Mm-hmm.
I can say, actually, there's a vast, huge literature that demonstrates that it is man-made, and that question is off the table so that we can talk about other issues that are more important. We don't have infinite amount of time. Vetted, that argument has been vetted out of this conversation by decades and decades of scholarship and scholarly papers. And if you want to make that argument, you have to come armed with evidence that demonstrates that climate change is not man-made, and that's now a high bar. But that's an example of kind of vetting ideas and faculty, within our professional norms of what it means to be a professor and how to engage ideas, are oftentimes find ourselves in a situation where we are able to say, no, we're not going to talk about the fact that there's only two genders, because all the science in our queer theory as a field says that there's a spectrum of genders. Likewise, we don't have to discuss that race is biological, because we know that race is socially constructed, especially within certain disciplines, right? And I think that oftentimes gets interpreted as being hostile to conservative speech, as opposed to being the evolution of an academic debate within the kind of realms and parameters of how those debates take place.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we're talking here about what some of this fear and some of the threats, I guess, mean within the classroom and within classroom debate. I'm wondering what you all think the impact could be systemically when we're talking about like course offerings or like different departments, programs, schools within colleges and universities, and even research topics. Earlier I interviewed somebody at the University of Iowa whose research that had been going on for 5 years into disinformation campaigns abroad had been terminated, based on its like Department of Defense funding. So anyway, just if we're looking at sort of what would be the systemic impact potentially from this.
Yeah, I think we've seen professors targeted by open records requests. We've seen them being fired from their research. We've seen legislatures put pressure on universities to stifle research that they find politically inconvenient for them, especially when it regards to climate change, oil and gas industries, environmental concerns. Unfortunately, it's a somewhat common phenomenon, and the systemic, I think, result here would be a lack of trust in the institutions to produce high quality research and to really pursue truth and provide this function for our society. And you can look at what's happening at universities like in foreign countries like Turkey, for example, which are totally captured by the government. And you see that all the research coming out is, guess what, pro-government, surprise, surprise there. And the people don't trust it, and it becomes a diminishing institution in the society because they become politically captured. And so the independence of the institutions are vital to ensuring that the output they produce is trusted and it's respected and it serves value to our society. And once these institutions do become captured, once they are under the control of the politicians and the legislatures, it becomes very suspect to see what they produce, especially when we know that unpopular research and teaching will be punished.
And I'd also like to point out just how important university research has been to economic prosperity in the United States. Like, we have the best science and technology sector of any nation around the world. Like, America is a leader in AI. We're a leader in biomedical work. We're a leader in neuroscience. Like, you can go down kind of field by field. And this is the reason so many international students have wanted to come to America. Like, they know we do the best job producing research and training students. And so I worry that the systemic consequence of this crackdown and also just the budget cuts that higher ed is suffering is it's going to hurt our economy down the road. It's going to hurt our ability to produce high quality research. It's going to hurt our ability to innovate. Like, a number of these tech companies, came out of universities, Stanford, Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, and other places. And so if we really weaken free speech on campus, if we weaken the ability of professors to undertake the kind of research that they want, there are going to be negative economic consequences down the road for this country.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I predicted, this hour is sort of flying by, but I want to get to a couple of things for sure. One of them is just the defense then, because I know that like FIRE, for example, has made it sort of its goal to defend or to fight back, I guess, against some of the stuff that's happening. And then we've seen Harvard or Columbia or different institutions make varying decisions. What do you all think about like the importance of standing up against some of this, or what you've seen in terms of institutional response?
Yeah, one thing that we found out was that when a professor is punished or investigated for their speech, they don't really know where to go. They're confused. They're wondering why they're being pulled out of the classroom or suspended for what they posted online or what they said to their students. It can be a very lonely, harrowing process, which is why FIRE created our Faculty Legal Defense Fund, which connects professors at public universities facing First Amendment issues with an attorney that can go and advise them, represent them, defend them during the disciplinary proceedings. And we want to do this approach because it is important to get in there early as a first responder program to get professionals the help they need before they get suspended or terminated or put on leave for months and months and months. and because we want to educate institutions as well about academic freedom, what it means, why it's important. Many times the administrators themselves aren't aware of why they're punishing the professor for, say, using pedagogically relevant language in class, or for posting online, or for really just fulfilling their core job responsibilities. And so that's on the professor level. The institutional level, these large institutions, the Harvards and Columbias of the world, they have their own legal teams, have their attorneys. We've helped them with support with amicus briefs when it comes to the cases they file. We are trying to inform the court of the academic freedom arguments here, to ensure that this doesn't happen at other universities out there. And of course, public commentary, right? Trying to educate the public, decision makers out there in our society about academic freedom, what it protects, why what Trump is doing to Harvard is wrong, and trying to get the future administrations of our presidency, for example, or Congress or legislatures to understand these values. It's a pretty long game. We may take a couple losses the next couple of years, but academic freedom has been around for a long time, and we hope that the last couple of years really show why it's really valuable in times of political strife.
I think it's really, I continue to be in awe of all the professors that go back into the classroom and continue to teach what they know is right, what their expertise and their training has led them, the arguments that they have faith in and that they believe, and that they have the evidence to demonstrate. And that happens every day. And the fact that faculty have to do it increasingly under threat and continue to do it, I think is really quite heroic. I also think that we're seeing a stand up of academic unions. We're seeing the AAUP, the AFT, and other unions that are really making a stand. When Harvard won its decision, it was the AAUP chapter that really pushed the institution to stand up to Trump's ransom note. I really hope that universities will learn with this this latest compact, where Trump is basically asking universities to sign on to a set of MAGA beliefs in order to get access to funding and preferential treatment. I hope the lesson is learned that you cannot capitulate to these, to ransom takers, and you have to stand up to them, because I think you see what happened to Columbia and Brown and UPenn, University of Virginia, and other places that have made concessions. And I think that when the history of this moment is told, it's going to be those faculty, those labor unions, those university leaders, those intellectuals, and the students who stand up and say, no, speech, academic freedom, a free exchange of ideas, and a free society is what's absolutely necessary. And we're going to defend it even in the face of authoritarianism.
Yeah, well, and I do want to get to the kind of Charlie Kirk comment piece as well, because that's not obviously necessarily somebody teaching in a classroom, or encouraging. That's not what we're talking. I mean, that may be happening, but that's not what's under debate in the public sphere. It's professors, faculty, staff, anybody graduate students making comments of their own personal nature on social media, and then facing repercussions. What do you all think about what rights people have, and what institution rights they have and what the Board of Regents, rights? What do you think about that and those issues we've been seeing lately?
Well, the New York Times just reported, I think it was last week, that 145 people, I think mostly at colleges and universities, have lost their jobs over this issue. I'm sure there is going to be litigation over this. So the ending remains to be told in terms of what the longer-term resolution is going to be. But the short-term resolution has been very challenging for those individuals.
I think, too, it's really important to take out what it was said. We can disagree with particular tweets, whatever, and that some of them, some people lost their jobs for simply requoting Charlie Kirk, basically saying, this is what this guy said, right? And some people got fired for saying things that I would never, ever, ever say, right? However, but in the face of this crazy public mourning that has become a kind of this insane spectacle in which we're all expected to give deference to Charlie Kirk as this great civil rights leader, supposedly, and anybody who questions that is somehow an enemy of the state. speaking up and saying, hey, come on, let's think about this a little bit critically is not an insane thing to do. Again, some people said it better than others, but I think what's at stake here is when the state itself steps in and says, when the governor of Texas literally tweets out, I want this person fired, then what you have is you have a pure example of censorship. The way that this should work, according to the principles of academic freedom, is if there was a complaint against a professor for something they posted on social media, what in the AUP we call extramural speech, there should be procedures in place in which that professor is brought before a committee. That committee should include committee of their peers, so include elected faculty to that position. And there should be a hearing that's transparent and has a process. There's due process involved and the right to appeal. And the question is not like, oh, I hated that tweet or that was outrageous. The question is, did this tweet demonstrate that faculty has, that there's cause to believe that faculty is not suitable to their position, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can imagine a tweet about Charlie Kirk in which it demonstrates that person is not suitable to be a professor anymore. But that is a pretty high standard to meet, right? And it's one that should be made in a deliberative process. If you take out that deliberative process and you give politicians, especially highly partisan politicians that have decided to weaponize and their attacks on higher education, then you basically said that individual politicians get to decide who is able to teach on campus and who's not, and we as faculty essentially become at-will employees and are constantly at risk of losing not only academic freedom but our jobs and livelihood. And it can be increasingly fickle, right? That an individual saying, "I don't like that tweet, therefore you're fired." There's no stability there, and every faculty member has to think, how will this social media post, how will this statement, how will this research article, how will this reading that I'm teaching in class be interpreted by this politician who has an ideologically warped understanding of what takes place in higher education?
The process is such an important point. I'm really glad you brought that up. And that's the opposite of what we're seeing right now. We're seeing summary terminations. We're seeing interim suspensions. We're seeing faculty members who log on Monday morning and realize they don't have a job anymore because they were never told what the charges are or what's happening here. As a result of the intense political pressure being put on the universities to act. And the one point I want to make with the Charlie Kirk fallout is that we have free speech, academic freedom to discuss political issues. And that absolutely includes the right to comment about people like Charlie Kirk, good or bad, dead or alive. You have the right to talk about him, what he did, what he said, all that stuff. And we also have free speech to discuss things people may think are controversial or offensive. We have the right to speak ill of the dead and to say things that may be mean about each other and to each other's families. If you're just talking about the weather, 2 + 2 = 4, you don't need free speech, right? You need free speech to discuss things that other people, even within your own university, your department, your society, think are controversial or offensive. And so to see people call for professors to be fired, what they say about Charlie Kirk, and for the institutions to accede to those demands, to give into that pressure, it's really sad to see. You expect the politicians and the general populace of America to understand what free speech means, and you would definitely expect institutions themselves to have a bit of a backbone here, stand on principle, and to not give in to the pressure to punish their professors for Charlie Kirk. Because if you give in to the pressure, all that creates is a more demand for censorship and less speech and more professors being fired. The institutions that have taken a principled stand for free speech, those are the ones that resist the pressure and really are doing a great job of protecting their faculty.
Yeah. And I do want to note, as we're talking about this, so the Board of Regents obviously recently fired an Iowa State University employee who made an offensive comment sort of about Charlie Kirk, and she was fired under a policy. So the Board of Regents has like a freedom of expression social media policy, and it said that employees are free basically to express personal opinions on their personal social media accounts. And they need to make sure that they're saying that they're doing this in their own personal capacity. But it also says that under certain circumstances, the universities can be obligated to act to prevent harm to the university campus community and its mission. And so she was fired under that clause. And I guess the point I want to make is that this policy that she violated, which I do see the argument for her violating that clause. It was just adopted in February. So this is a brand new policy. Before that, the free expression policy just said the university shall not take action in any such way to, unduly pressure members of the community in their personal capacities to adopt any viewpoint. So before it was pretty succinct. Now it includes these clauses. And obviously in February, that was during the legislative session, so anyway, that's what I mean when I'm talking about like systemic changes. I guess I'm just, and then what sort of implications that have going forward. I'm going to ask another quick question that we've received as we've got about 10 minutes left here. It says, please talk about the Pickering balance test. I don't really know exactly what it is, but it says how much detail has to be given about the efficiency of the public services for the limits on free speech at public universities to hold.
I can take that one. I'll try to explain it the best I can. It's kind of an esoteric legal test, so I apologize for the legalese. So the standard by which the U.S. government can discipline its employees, whether it's public professors, people working under the government, any way, shape, or form, government agencies. It's called the Pickering-Connick-Garcetti balancing test, named after a series of Supreme Court decisions. And the whole idea is that public employees retain the right to speak out on a matter of public concern in their own private capacities. When they're speaking not on behalf of the institution, when they're talking on social media, for example, they can talk about things like Charlie Kirk, about public issues. Once that's established, the employer can still discipline them if their speech disrupts the operations of the institution or causes inefficiencies in the workplace. And that standard is very malleable in a way. Some courts do a really good job of ensuring that there's no heckler's vetoes, that the third-party reactions to the speech are not used to justify punishing the professor, for example, or the public employee. A lot of cases about firemen and police officers being punished with the post on social media, and the courts have said that these institutions really cannot invoke reputational concerns to justify the punishment. It has to be substantial and severe disruption to the operations of the services to justify the punishment. And this could really only come into effect when the speech is really, really hateful, when it involves racial slurs or racial discrimination or harassment. And when it shows, like Isaac mentioned before, either unfitness to teach on behalf of the professor or just a total lack of trust in the department from, say, a police officer who's just being openly racist and says he can't, for example, serve Black people. So it's a really high standard. It's a high bar. Unfortunately, some courts defer to the university or defer to the institution a lot and kind of just have a very low bar when it comes to the disruption. And they have incorporated things like just the public's reaction to the speech or the offensiveness of the speech to the colleagues and to the student at the university punish the professor. And we always argue that the principles of free speech should ensure that merely offensive speech remains protected. That professors who talk about public issues should retain that right, even if it offends others, and that has to be an incredibly high bar for disruption to occur at the institution to justify the punishment.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. Thanks for kind of talking us through that. I did kind of want, as we wrap it up here, to see kind of what each of you are going to be watching or looking for, or maybe where you see this going, this issue, if it gets worse, better, or different in any way. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Thought is that the crisis that we're in now didn't happen in the last few years. The truth is that the patient of higher education has been weak for decades. It's been underfunded. It's become inaccessible to too many Americans. The size of the community colleges is the same seats in the 1970s as there are now, even though demand has greatly outstripped supply. There's all of this reason that instead of really developing robust higher education institutions that every American has the opportunity to access, and every American has the experience, if they desire it, to attend an academic institution, what's happened with growing austerity, increased experience of debt, people taking out debt and not being able to complete their degrees and be burdened with debt. Those are the real problems facing higher education. It's not like a woke professor or a student shouting down a law professor at Stanford, right? The real problems is the systemic crisis of higher education. And until we address that, then I think that it's really easy to treat higher education as a boogeyman, right? To say every higher education institution is an elite institution. And you can see how the narratives that have weaponized against higher education, they look at examples of Columbia and Harvard and treat those places as a kind of internal enemy, a hostile force, right? And I think that until Americans are able to access higher education in a robust way, it's going to be hard to explain to the vast public that higher education is something that is a common good, a public good, that everybody who's of a certain, should have access to. And that is the ultimate, I think, a response. And as we try to survive the current moment, and should higher education survive, I hope that instead of just going back to the higher education system that we had 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that we really think about how to make our institutions much more robust, expansive, inclusive, diverse, and welcoming to all people, and that we really put our resources behind it. Because in a country like the United States, it's shameful that that very, very deserving students don't have access to higher education, and especially in this world that requires advanced degrees more than ever before. This is something that should be not a scarce commodity, but it's something that should be available for all and valued throughout society.
Yeah.
And I think what I am watching for is how the Supreme Court handles these recent cases and what kind of decisions that they make. I mean, at the district court level, there actually already been a number of rulings that are pretty supportive of freedom of speech issues. But I think our legal system has had difficulty dealing with free speech in a digital world, because in the pre-digital world, there actually were many free speech cases that got resolved. And our country basically came up with some dividing lines of, this is acceptable free speech. Here are limits. Here are things that one cannot say or do. But somehow in the digital world, we've had difficulty applying those nuanced legal precedents to the internet and social media platforms and the video world. So I would like to see our legal system do a better job kind of taking the legal precedents that we already have and applying them to the digital space, because obviously the digital world is where a lot of these disputes are taking place now, and we need clearer lines in the same way that we had them in the pre-digital world.
Yeah, absolutely.
As someone who lives in Philadelphia, I'm obligated to say that I've been watching the Philadelphia Eagles, of course, continue to crush the NFL season the next couple of weeks, doing a great job there. Otherwise, in all seriousness, I do agree with what my fellow panelists aptly stated about the purpose of university and what it represents in American society. And I'll be watching to see whether universities will stand on principle, understand their role, the importance of their role, the resources they have, and pursue the pursuit of truth and the points of academic freedom, or whether they'll continue to kowtow to politicians, give into pressure to crack down on speech and faculty, which we've been seeing, unfortunately, the last couple years. We hope that they do the former, and we're here to support them when they do.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I really think it was an insightful conversation, and yeah, I learned quite a bit from it. So thanks again for that. I'll just note for people listening in that the next education track session, the last one of the day this afternoon, is on navigating a post-DEI Iowa education system. Given the laws that prohibit a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion related spending and training, et cetera. And then tomorrow, when it restarts again, the higher education track that I'll be leading in the morning at 9:40 is on 3-year degrees and dual enrollment and some of the different degree paths that we're seeing for students these days. So anyway, you can tune into that. So thanks again, you all, for joining me, and for everyone for listening in. Have a good afternoon.